Final Fantasy XIV is a massive game with various quests, fights, stories, and of course, game mechanics, many of which aren't explained that well or even at all. Worse yet is the fact that most of the unexplained mechanics tend to be some of the more useful or outright necessary. But with that being said, here are 5 things that the game doesn't tell you that you do really need to know about. Role actions are special abilities shared by all jobs of a given role, meaning no matter what healer you choose to play, you'll always have access to abilities like Asuna or Lucid Dreaming. But unlike normal job abilities, these won't ever get level synced once they've been unlocked, meaning you can use things like Arm's Length, which is unlocked at level 32, even if you've been synced to say level 15. Speaking of which, let's talk about some of the specific role abilities, starting with the aforementioned Arm's Length. Now, this ability's primary use is to provide immunity to knockback attacks. However, it actually has a secondary effect that many players, both new and old, tend to ignore or just misunderstand. You see, while Arm's Length is active, it provides a barrier that causes enemies to be inflicted with the slow debuff when they hit said barrier. Now, many see this and don't think about the slow debuff, or they believe that the debuff just slows movement speed, but that's not the case. You see, it actually affects action speed, meaning those inflicted with it attack slower, making Arm's Length a pretty decent tanking cooldown when dealing with non-bosses that aren't immune to the debuff. Our next confusing role actions are Interject and Head Graze, both of which are skills that interrupt enemy abilities. Unfortunately, telling which abilities can and can't be interrupted tends to be a bit difficult to determine. That is, if you don't know the actual indicator for it. Now, most enemies are going to have a normal cast bar when using an attack. However, abilities that can be interrupted actually have something slightly different. You see, when an attack can be interrupted, the cast bar will actually constantly flash, showing you that you can use abilities like Interject and or Head Graze to stop it. Moving on to our final confusing role action, we have Asuna, which removes a debuff from any ally. Now, like with the interruption skills, being able to tell what you can and can't remove with Asuna can be difficult if you don't know what to look for. But again, like with interruptions, there is an indicator to show what debuffs can actually be removed. You see, normal debuffs are usually a single solid image, but debuffs that can be removed actually have this blue bar above them to show that they can be removed. Enmity, or aggro, is a system that exists in most MMORPGs, and Final Fantasy XIV is not an exception to this. However, despite the fact that the system is relatively commonplace, it is still somewhat confusing for new players, especially when it comes to building and monitoring it. But let's start with building aggro. Tanks are actually the only role that have resources for generating enmity built into their kits. However, for the other roles, it can be done by doing essentially anything, whether it be doing damage or healing the party. And the more you do of whatever, the more enmity you generally build. Now, when it comes to seeing your given enmity for a target, all you need to do is take a look at the party list, as every player is going to have both a number showing the current enmity order and a bar showing how close you are to the person ahead of you. The only exception to this is the target with aggro, who will have the letter A instead of a number. However, the party list isn't the only way to see enmity. Another way is by looking at the enemy list. Here, your enmity is going to be shown through colors and shapes instead of numbers and bars. Green indicates you have a very low amount, yellow shows that you have a decent amount, orange means that you have a large amount, and red indicates you are currently the enemy's main target. When it comes to using these two resources, the party list is usually better for handling single target, while the enemy list allows you to see the enmity of multiple different targets. Now, building and monitoring isn't the only thing to know when it comes to aggro, especially if you plan on tackling content like deep dungeons or exploration zones where you'll have to learn about aggro types. You see, for most normal content like dungeons, you'll only ever deal with proximity enemies that aggro if you get too close to them, but there are more than just proximity. There's also sight enemies that only aggro if they physically see you, sound enemies which aggro if you don't walk next to them, magic enemies which aggro if you use any spell near them, and lastly, blood enemies which will aggro if you're on low health. And as long as you don't trigger one of the conditions for the aggro type, then the enemy's not going to aggro, something which most players have to find the hard way if they choose to do Eureka or Bastia. Limit breaks are powerful actions which have 3 levels of strength and only become available once you enter a party of 4 or more people, which is also why Limit Break is actually a party resource rather than a personal one, meaning that once used by any member, it will become unavailable for anyone else until the party fills the limit gauge again. And the reason that this matters is because each role has their own unique limit break that each help in different situations. Tanks give the party a powerful mitigation, healers heal the party and even resurrect them when they use level 3, melees perform perform a powerful single target attack. Physical range perform a powerful line AoE, and lastly, casters perform a powerful circle AoE. And while DPS are the ones that will most often use Limit Break, there will be moments when things like Tank LB3 are needed to survive certain attacks. But with that being said, how do you actually go about building your Limit Break? Well, there's actually quite a few ways of doing it. The first of which is just time. You see, each bar of Limit Break has a general time that it takes to fill, with every bar taking roughly 6 minutes to fill in light parties and roughly 2 minutes to fill in full parties, assuming no penalties. Speaking of which, your passive LB generation actually depends on your party composition, as you'll actually start to receive penalties if you deviate from what is considered the normal party comp of 1 tank, 1 healer, and 2 DPS for light parties, or 2 tanks, 2 healers, and 4 DPS, 3 of which need to be melee, physical range, and caster for full parties, which also have a separate set of penalties if there's any repeat jobs, such as both tanks being a warrior. Now, if you do actually have any of these penalties, your passive LB generation will be slowed by a pretty significant amount, with the first penalty slowing at about 35 seconds and then 15 plus for every penalty afterwards, up to a maximum of 5. Moving on from passive generation, now let's talk about active generation, which are things you can actively do to increase your limit break. Now, the first of these is actually something that we've already covered with role actions, interrupting. You see, anytime you stomp an enemy, whether through stunning the target or using interrupt skills, you'll actually generate some amount of limit gauge, ranging from a little to none depending on the instance or even the enemy that's being interrupted. After interruptions, we have surviving lethal damage. You see, if an attack would kill you, but you use a shield or mitigation that makes it so you don't die, you'll actually build a decent amount of limit gauge. However, this only works if the attack would do enough damage to kill you if not mitigated, meaning that if you use an ability that lowers the enemy's damage, like Reprisal, Feint, or Addle, then the attack would stop being lethal, and thus you wouldn't build any limit gauge from being hit by it. Now, sticking with the idea of low health, another way to build LB is by healing a target or targets that are below 10% of their maximum HP. And the last main way to build limit break is by completing specific mechanics or killing boss ads. And usually when this happens is because a tank LB is going to be needed, though that isn't always true. Buffs and debuffs are a mechanic that exists in various different genres, not just MMOs, and understanding how these interact with one another can be the difference between winning and losing fights. Now, in Final Fantasy XIV, again, like many other games, buffs and debuffs stack multiplicatively rather than additively, which, to very much oversimplify, means that if you're increasing something, you'll generally get more from stacking buffs, while if you're decreasing something, you'll usually get less. For example, let's take a look at Nebula and Rampart, which are both mitigations, meaning they decrease damage. Nebula by 30% and Rampart by 20%. Now, because the buffs are multiplicative, if you were to use both mitigations together, instead of getting a 50% mitigation, you would only actually get about 44%, meaning that in exchange for a stronger mitigation, you lose about 6%. However, on the opposite end, if we were to stack No Mercy, a 20% damage buff, and Divination, a 6% damage buff, we would end up with a total buff of 27% rather than 26%, meaning that we get a bonus 1% by stacking our buffs together. Now, stacking isn't the only thing we need to talk about when it comes to the buffs, as there's also the confusing difference between healing magic and healing actions. You see, abilities like Temperance provide a healing buff. However, it specifically specifies it buffs healing magic potency, which means Temperance only buffs healing abilities that are classified as spells. So things like Tetragrammaton won't receive the buff as it's a healing ability, not a healing spell. However, Asylum, on the other hand, provides a healing buff that specifies healing actions, which means any spell or ability that provides healing will actually receive the buff by Asylum. Now, the last thing to talk about in reference to buffs and debuffs is how they affect over time effects. You see, if you were to place a damage over time effect like Stormbite on a target while under Raging Strikes, a 15% damage buff, the Stormbite would receive the buff to its damage for the entire duration, even if the attack was used at the very last second of its duration. However, on the other end, if you were to use Stormbite, then activate Raging Strikes, the dot wouldn't be buffed retroactively, meaning in order to take advantage of the damage buff, you would actually have to reapply your dot, and this principle applies to all other overtime effects like regens. Snapshotting, the process which the game uses to determine when events happen, is by far the most important thing you need to know that the game does not tell you about. Because if you don't know how snapshotting works, then you're going to find yourself taking unnecessary damage or even dying to attacks that you thought you dodged. You see, in 14, damage doesn't always happen when you think it does. In fact, for most new players, they'll likely see an attack and think that the damage happens with the animation, but strangely enough, that's rarely the case. This is because in 14, 14, damage actually works in stages known as snapshots, where the game basically takes pictures and then uses said pictures to determine what happened. So for simplicity's sake, let's say that an attack takes 3 pictures when it's being executed. The first picture shows where the attack is going to be, the second picture shows the moment that the attack actually goes off, and the third picture just shows the animation for the attack. Now the mistake that many players tend to make is focusing on that third picture rather than the second, leading to them trying to dodge the animation, which isn't really doing anything. Instead, they should be looking at when that second picture is being taken, as the moment it is, the damage is set in stone no matter where you are when the animation plays. Which raises the question, when does the game actually take that second picture? Well, thankfully there is a tried and true way of telling when the game is going to take an important snapshot, that being the enemy cast bar. You see, almost any time you see an enemy start casting an attack, said attack is going to snapshot the second that that cast bar finishes, which is why when it's done you can often move into where the AoE was and stand in the animation taking no damage, because the damage has already happened. Now, while that is how most attacks snapshot, there are some exceptions, usually with attacks that are continuous. But even in those cases, there's usually something to indicate when the snapshot is going to happen. Take this attack from the first criterion as an example. The lines on the floor show where the boss's clones are going to dash and then cleave. Now, the snapshot for this attack is actually that same line, as the moment it disappears, the snapshot for the first cleaves are set. Or another example is rotating attacks that after their initial cast continue to do damage until they finish their rotation. And the secret to these is that they snapshot shortly after the previous animation goes off, which is why you never want to be in the path of the rotation, as it's incredibly difficult to avoid getting hit. Now, so far we've only talked about snapshotting in reference to enemy attacks, but the fact is, snapshotting applies to almost everything found in the game. Like earlier in the buff section, we briefly talked about how if you use a dot or hot under the effect of a buff, they'll receive that buff for the entire duration, even if used at the literal last second. This is because you snapshotted the attack under that buff. And the same thing applies to all other buffs and debuffs as well. So if you were to mitigate before a snapshot happens, the damage will be reduced, but if you're late and it doesn't go off until after the snapshot, then you won't receive the mitigation, even if it was only a split second late. Now, if you found this video helpful, please consider liking it and possibly subscribing to the channel so you know when I upload new videos. Also, you may want to consider checking out one of my other guides, which should be appearing shortly, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the comments and I'll do my best to answer them if I'm able. With all that being said, thanks for watching, and I wish you the best on your 14 journey.